The night Bessie Fletcher pounded her fist against the wrong door in Caldwell, Kansas, she was still wearing her wedding dress, and the hem of it was caked with 3 inches of red prairie mud. It was the autumn of 1878, and the town of Caldwell sat like a sentry post at the edge of the Cherokee Strip, a wild and breathing border between the civilized world and everything that lay beyond it. The cattle trade was thunderous that year, with longhorns bawling in the holding pens south of town, and trail hands spending their wages on whiskey and card games, and things they would regret come morning. The Santa Fe Railroad had brought commerce and noise and strangers by the dozens, and the main street of Caldwell smelled always of horse dung and sawdust and frying meat. It was not a gentle town. It did not pretend to be. But it was exactly the kind of town where a desperate woman in a ruined wedding dress could disappear into the chaos of a Saturday night without anyone paying her much mind, and that was precisely what Bessie Fletcher needed. She had been running for nearly 2 hours. She did not know the town well. She had arrived by stagecoach only 4 days earlier, escorted by her uncle, Horace Fletcher, who had arranged the whole business with the practiced efficiency of a man conducting a livestock transaction. That was, in fact, how Bessie had privately thought of it since the letter arrived 6 months ago at the Fletcher family homestead outside of Abilene. She was to be married to a man named Gerald Pratt, a rancher of considerable means who had written to Horace after reading a notice in a frontier gazette. The notice had been placed without Bessie's knowledge. She had been 22 years old and quietly furious when she found out, and she had been quietly furious ever since, right up until the moment during the wedding reception supper when Gerald Pratt leaned across the table and told her, with a smile that did not reach his eyes, that she would give away her horse first thing in the morning because women on his ranch did not ride. That had been the thing that broke it open. It was not the only thing. There had been Gerald's cold hands during the ceremony, and the way he spoke to his ranch hands with a casual cruelty that made her stomach clench, and the manner in which he had looked at her not as a person, but as an acquisition successfully completed. But it was the horse that crystallized everything into sudden, terrifying clarity. Her horse, a dun mare named Clover whom she had raised from a foal and loved with a ferocity that embarrassed her sometimes, was not going to be given away. And neither was Bessie Fletcher. She had excused herself from the table, walked through the kitchen of the Pratt Ranch house with the serene deliberateness of a woman who intended to return, slipped out the back door into the autumn dark, and run. She had taken nothing but the dress on her back and the small folding knife she kept in the hidden pocket her mother had sewn into every skirt she had ever made. Her mother had been a practical woman who trusted God and nobody else, and she had taught Bessie to do the same. Bessie ran across the open pasture, ducked through the fence line, and hit the road to Caldwell at a pace that made her lungs burn. She heard no pursuit behind her. Perhaps Gerald had not noticed her absence yet. Perhaps he had simply not cared enough to come after her immediately. Either way, the 2 miles between the Pratt Ranch and the edge of Caldwell gave her enough time to arrive breathless and terrified, and absolutely determined not to go back. The problem was that she had nowhere to go. Her Uncle Horace was staying at the Leland Hotel, but Horace had engineered this entire catastrophe, and she trusted him about as far as she could throw him. She knew no one in Caldwell, had no money, no luggage, and no plan beyond the raw instinct that had propelled her out that kitchen door. She needed shelter. She needed someone who would not immediately drag her back to Gerald Pratt. She needed, more than anything, to think. The boarding house she was aiming for was a place she had noticed on her first day in town, a tidy white building with green shutters run by a Mrs. Calloway who had nodded pleasantly at Bessie when the stagecoach passed. She remembered it was on Merchant Street, 2 blocks east of the main cattle pens. In the dark and the confusion of Saturday night Caldwell, with trail hands whooping and fiddle music bleeding out of every saloon doorway, she lost her bearings entirely. She turned right when she should have turned left. She went 2 blocks north instead of 2 blocks east. She ended up on a quieter street she did not recognize, a row of modest but solid houses with dark windows and sleeping flower gardens, and she was shaking with cold and exhaustion and the peculiar grief that comes from having your entire future collapse in a single evening. She chose the house with the lamp burning in the front window. She knocked. She knocked harder. She raised her fist and struck the door 3 times with everything she had, because the cold was biting through the satin of her wedding dress, and her feet were numb inside her good shoes, and the darkness behind her felt enormous and full of consequences. The door opened. Jacob Hudson stood in the doorway holding a kerosene lantern in one hand and looking at her with an expression she could not immediately name. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw covered in several days of shadow. He was wearing a flannel shirt and work trousers with suspenders and no boots, the clothes of a man who had been sitting by his fire reading before he was interrupted. He was 30 years old. He had brown eyes that caught the lantern light and held it. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he has not been expecting and cannot quite believe is real. Bessie stared up at him and said the first words that came to her, which were, "I am not going back." Jacob Hudson looked at the ruined wedding dress. He looked at the mud on the hem and the terror in her eyes and the small dignified set of her chin that contradicted the trembling of her lower lip. He looked at all of it for one long moment, and then he stepped back from the doorway and held the door open wider and said, "Then you had better come inside." He did not ask her name right away. He took her wet wrap and hung it near the fire. He put a kettle on the stove and pulled a chair close to the hearth and gestured for her to sit, and she sat because her legs had decided they were done regardless of what the rest of her intended. The house was small and clean and smelled of wood smoke and leather, and the faint sweetness of pine. There were books on a shelf above the fireplace, more books than she had expected, and a pair of worn gloves on the table and a bridle hanging on a peg by the back door. There was a dog sleeping in the corner, a big brown mutt who opened one eye at her arrival, determined she was not a threat, and went back to sleep. Bessie sat in the chair and felt the warmth of the fire begin to work its way through the cold that had settled into her bones, and she pressed her hands together in her lap and tried to think about what came next. She was aware that she was in a stranger's house in the middle of the night wearing a wedding dress, and that this was, by any reasonable standard, a remarkable situation. She was also aware that the stranger was making tea with quiet efficiency and had not yet asked her a single intrusive question, and that this felt like an extraordinary act of kindness. "My name is Bessie Fletcher," she said finally. "I was married tonight to a man named Gerald Pratt. I left." Jacob set a cup of tea on the small table beside her chair. He pulled a second chair over and sat down across the fire from her, not too close, the proper distance of a man who understood the importance of making a frightened woman feel safe. "Jacob Hudson," he said, "this is my house. You knocked on it. I was looking for the Callaway boarding house. That is 2 streets over and 1 block south. I got turned around." He nodded as if this were the most natural thing in the world. "Gerald Pratt," he repeated quietly. "Big ranch south of town, gray-bearded man. You know him. I know of him." Something in Jacob's voice shifted barely perceptibly, a slight tightening, and then he smoothed it away. "Did he hurt you?" "Not the way you mean," Bessie said carefully. "Not yet." Jacob looked at the fire. His hands, resting on his knees, were large and calloused and still. "Do you have family in town who will help you?" "My uncle arranged the marriage. He will not help." She paused. "My parents are both gone. I have no one here who is mine." Jacob was quiet for a moment. The fire cracked and settled. Outside, distantly, the Saturday night sounds of Caldwell continued their cheerful indifference to the crisis occurring on this particular quiet street. "You can stay tonight," he said. "I have a spare room. It has a lock on it. In the morning we can figure out the rest." Bessie looked at him. She was measuring him the way her mother had taught her to measure men, not by the broadness of their shoulders or the silver in their wallet, but by the small decisions they made when they thought no one important was watching. The way he had stepped back from the doorway. The way he had hung up her wrap and not asked a single question designed to make her feel obligated. The way he was looking at the fire now instead of at her, giving her his attention without making it a weight she had to carry. "Why are you being kind to me?" she asked. "You do not know me at all." Jacob glanced at her then, and something in his expression was very direct and very honest. "Because you knocked on my door in the middle of the night in a wedding dress," he said. "And it would take a particular kind of man to turn you away, and I hope I am not that particular kind." Bessie Fletcher, who had not cried once during the entire evening, not during the ceremony or the supper or the running or the cold, felt her eyes sting very suddenly and turned back to the fire. "Thank you," she said softly. "Drink your tea," Jacob said. "It will help." He showed her the spare room, which was small and tidy with a quilt on the bed and a washstand with a pitcher of clean water. He found her a flannel nightgown that had belonged to his sister, who had left it behind on her last visit, and laid it on the foot of the bed without comment. He said good night. He closed the door. She turned the key in the lock, not because she feared him, she realized with some surprise, but out of simple habit. She lay in the dark and listened to the sounds of the house, the settling of the walls, the distant pop of the fire in the next room, and she thought about Gerald Pratt's smile that did not reach his eyes, and then she stopped thinking about Gerald Pratt and thought instead about the way Jacob Hudson had looked at her in the doorway, not with pity or suspicion or calculation, but with something that had seemed very much like recognition. She did not understand it yet, but she did not forget it either. In the morning, she woke to the smell of coffee and bacon, and the sound of someone moving around a kitchen with confident familiarity. She washed her face at the washstand and changed into the flannel nightgown, and then realized she had nothing to change into after that, which presented a practical problem of some immediacy. She pulled the wedding dress back on with considerable distaste and went out into the main room. Jacob was at the stove. He turned when he heard her footsteps and looked at the dress and looked at her face and said, "I was thinking about that. My sister is close to your size. She left a trunk here last summer with some things in it. She would not mind. You have already thought about this." "I woke early," he said simply. "I think early." The trunk produced a serviceable blue calico dress and a brown wool skirt and a white cotton blouse and a pair of stockings. Bessie changed in the spare room and came out feeling enormously better, like herself rather than a symbol of someone else's transaction. She braided her dark hair at the kitchen table while Jacob set out plates, and the domesticity of the scene struck her with a strange poignancy. The ordinariness of it, breakfast and daylight and a man cooking without being asked. "You cook," she observed. "I live alone," he said. "You either learn or you suffer. My father was the same way after my mother passed." She accepted the plate he set before her. "It is an unusual quality in a man out here. I have been told I am an unusual man." He sat across from her and poured 2 cups of coffee. "What is your plan, Miss Fletcher, for today?" She looked at him steadily. "I need to get to the bank before my uncle does. I have a small amount of money in my own name, a savings account I opened in Abilene before we left. My uncle does not know about it. I need to withdraw it and send a telegram to a friend in Dodge City who may be able to take me in." She paused. "And I need to know if Gerald Pratt is likely to come looking for me here." Jacob wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "He may look. Caldwell is not a large town." He glanced up at her. "What I can tell you is that Gerald Pratt and I are not friends, and I am not in the habit of helping men who do not deserve help." "What is your occupation, Mr. Hudson?" "I raise horses," he said. "Quarter horses and some thoroughbred crosses. I sell to ranchers, to the cavalry at Fort Dodge, and to anyone else who has the sense to recognize a good animal." He paused. "I also have a small piece of land south of town, about 300 acres. It is not grand, but it is mine." A horseman. Bessie thought of Clover still in Gerald Pratt's stable at this very moment and felt the familiar ache. "Do you have many horses currently?" 14 on the property, 3 mares in foal." Something in his expression warmed slightly. "Do you know horses?" "I raised one from a foal," she said. She is still at the Pratt Ranch. Her name is Clover. She said it without the emotion she felt, but some of it must have come through anyway because Jacob looked at her with quiet attention. How long have you had her? 4 years. She is a dun. 14 hands. The best horse I have ever known. Bessie looked at her coffee cup. Gerald told me last night that I would give her away this morning. That women on his ranch did not ride. The silence that followed was brief but complete. Jacob said nothing for a moment, and then he said, "That was when you left. That was when I left." He nodded slowly, and in his nod she read something she had not expected, not judgment, not amusement, but a genuine and serious understanding. As if the thing that had broken it open for her was not absurd or small, but was, in fact, exactly the thing it ought to have been. They went to the bank together at 8 o'clock, Jacob walking alongside her on the wooden sidewalk in the cool autumn morning. He had put on his hat and his coat and his boots, and he walked at her shoulder in a way that was neither possessive nor performative but simply present, a man accompanying a woman who might need a witness or a shield. The town was quieter by daylight, the saloons shut up, the cattle pens beginning their morning noise. A few people on the street glanced at them with the idle curiosity of a small town, and then looked away. The bank manager was a narrow man named Tibbets who looked at Bessie with barely concealed alarm when she gave her name, and she understood immediately that word had traveled already. Gerald Pratt was a man of means and influence, and he had apparently been busy since the previous night. "Mrs. Pratt," Tibbets began, and Bessie said with perfect calm, "Miss Fletcher. I was not married last evening. I left before the evening concluded." This was not entirely accurate in a legal sense, she knew, and the legal question of the thing was going to have to be addressed, but she was operating on the theory that a confident statement delivered without hesitation had its own form of truth. "I need to access my account." Tibbets looked at Jacob. Jacob looked at Tibbets with an expression of perfectly neutral patience that somehow communicated an absolute expectation of cooperation. Tibbets found the account. He processed the withdrawal. He handed Bessie $43.70 and did not make eye contact with either of them as they left. On the sidewalk outside, Bessie exhaled. The $43 felt warm and solid in her hand, like a foundation. "Thank you," she said to Jacob. "I did not do anything." "You stood there," she said. "That was the thing that needed doing." He looked at her briefly, and then he looked down the street, and she saw a faint color in his jaw that might have been the morning cold and might have been something else. "The telegraph office is at the end of the block," he said. She sent the telegram to her friend Clara in Dodge City. Clara Hennessy was a schoolteacher who had gone west 3 years earlier with ideas about education on the frontier, and who had written Bessie letters full of practical wisdom and genuine affection. Clara would help. Clara would write back within a day or two. In the meantime, Bessie needed somewhere to stay that was not Gerald Pratt's house and not her uncle's hotel room. She was contemplating this when she became aware of a figure approaching down the main street with the bearing of a man accustomed to having the space around him clear automatically. Gerald Pratt was 60 years old, lean and gray-bearded as Jacob had said, and he walked with the deliberate steadiness of a man who had never learned to hurry because he had never had to. He had 2 ranch hands with him, big men in trail coats, and he was scanning the sidewalk ahead of him with cold purpose. Bessie did not run. She had done her running, but she stepped closer to Jacob instinctively, and Jacob, without looking at her or making any dramatic gesture, simply shifted his weight so that he was between her and the street. Gerald saw her. He stopped. His gray eyes moved from her to Jacob, and his expression changed in a way that was not quite anger but was something worse, the controlled displeasure of a man who considers certain things his property and has found that property has walked away. "Bessie," he said. He did not raise his voice. "Mr. Pratt," she said. She was surprised by how steady her own voice was. "You will come back with me now," he said. "This is embarrassing for both of us and it needs to end." "No," she said. "It ended last night." Gerald's eyes went to Jacob again. "Hudson," he said the name like a fact being acknowledged. You want to tell me what you think you are doing? Having a conversation on a public sidewalk, Jacob said pleasantly. Same as you. She is my wife. She says otherwise. The coldness in Gerald's face sharpened. This is not your business. She knocked on my door, Jacob said. That made it my business. He said it without heat and without bluster, and there was something in his absolute steadiness that was more commanding than shouting would have been. The two ranch hands shifted. Jacob noticed. He did not appear to be concerned, but Bessie noticed that he had positioned himself with his back to the telegraph office wall, and she understood, with the clarity of someone raised around working men, that he had thought about this. Gerald Pratt looked at Bessie for a long moment. His expression contained something she read as the calculation of a man deciding whether a pursuit was worth its cost. Finally he said, "We will discuss this properly, not in the street." And he turned and walked away, his men following, and the morning absorbed him and his coldness back into itself. Bessie realized she had been holding her breath. She let it out slowly. Beside her, Jacob was watching the retreating figures with quiet attention, and then he looked at her. "We should get you settled somewhere that is not my front step," he said. "Your house is on the wrong side of town from the Callaway boarding house," she said, "and Gerald Pratt likely knows where the Callaway boarding house is." Jacob considered this. "There is another option," he said carefully. "My ranch property is about 2 miles out of town. It is not elegant, but it has a proper second room, and I am out in the barn or the pasture most of the day. You would have the house largely to yourself." He paused, and she could see him measuring the propriety of what he was saying against the practical reality of her situation. "My neighbor, Mrs. Aragon, is a widow with grown children, and she checks in on the property when I am in town. It would be decent. I want you to know that is how I mean it." Bessie looked at him. She was 22 years old, and she had been raised carefully, and she understood the social architecture of what he was suggesting and the genuine risk to her reputation. She also understood that her reputation had already sustained considerable damage by leaving her wedding supper and spending the night in an unmarried man's house, and that practical necessity had to take precedence over convention when convention had already been thoroughly upended. "I think," she said slowly, "that you are the most straightforwardly decent man I have encountered in a considerable length of time, and I accept." He brought a horse around from the livery, a dark bay gelding named Amos, who was clearly fond of him in the way that horses are fond of people who understand them, and helped her up onto the second horse. A quiet sorrel mare, he said, was named Patience. They rode the 2 miles out of town in the cool autumn morning, and Bessie felt the familiar ease of being on horseback settle into her spine and shoulders, and breathed the clean air of the Kansas plains, and felt, for the first time since she had arrived in Caldwell, something approaching calm. The ranch was small and neat. There was a log house with a good stone chimney and a front porch with 2 chairs on it, and a solid barn painted red, and a series of paddocks where horses moved in the morning light with the particular grace of well-kept animals. Bessie counted them as she rode in. 14, he had said. She could see 9 in the immediate paddocks, several clearly the quality stock he had mentioned. A woman came out of the neighboring property before they had dismounted, a stout Mexican woman of perhaps 60 with silver-streaked black hair and sharp dark eyes, and Jacob introduced her as Mrs. Conception Aragon, and Mrs. Aragon looked at Bessie with frank assessment, and then said to Jacob in English that still carried the music of Spanish, "She is the one from town, from Pratt's business." "She needed a place," Jacob said. "Of course she did." Mrs. Aragon switched her assessment to Bessie. "You were married to that cold man." "Briefly," Bessie said. "He is not good, Mrs. Aragon said with the simplicity of someone stating whether. "Jacob is good." She said it without any apparent sense that this was a remarkable thing to announce directly to both parties. "I will bring food this afternoon." And she turned and walked back toward her own property with the air of someone who had settled the matter. Jacob looked at Bessie with a trace of something that might have been embarrassment. "Mrs. Aragon is direct," he said. "I noticed," Bessie said. "I liked it." He showed her the house. It was well made and simple and clean in the way that a man's house is clean when he has learned to value order. Not immaculate but organized. Every tool in its place. Every book standing straight on the shelf. The second room was modest but had a good bed and a window that looked east over the paddocks, and Bessie stood at that window and watched the horses moving in the morning light and felt the strange sensation of arriving somewhere. The days that followed had their own particular rhythm. Jacob rose before dawn and was in the barn before the sun touched the horizon. Bessie woke to the sound of him working and lay still for a while listening to the familiar sounds of horses and morning, and then she rose and made coffee, because it seemed the thing to do. The first morning he came in for breakfast and found coffee made and looked at the pot, and then at her with an expression she could not quite interpret and said nothing, only poured a cup and sat down. The second morning he said thank you. The third morning he brought in fresh eggs from the 3 hens he kept in a pen beside the barn, and they made breakfast together with a natural division of tasks that had not been discussed but simply emerged, and neither of them remarked on it. She helped with the horses. She asked permission the first time, explaining her experience with Clover, and Jacob said, "Show me." And she went into the paddock with one of the more skittish young mares and spent 20 minutes talking quietly and moving slowly and bringing the animal around to her. And when she came out, Jacob was leaning on the fence rail with an expression she was beginning to recognize as his form of being impressed. "You have good hands," he said. "My father taught me," she said. He said a good hand with a horse is not about strength, it is about patience and honesty. Jacob looked at the mare, who had followed Bessie to the fence rail and was now standing companionably close. "Smart man," he said. Clara's reply telegram arrived on the 4th day, brought out by a boy from town who delivered messages for a small fee. Clara would come if Bessie needed her, but Clara also wrote that she trusted Bessie's judgment above all things and that if Bessie felt safe where she was, she should stay until the legal situation was resolved. The legal situation was what complicated things. The question of the marriage was not simple. A territorial justice of the peace named Harmon had performed the ceremony. Whether Bessie's departure before the evening concluded constituted some form of legal remedy was unclear. She needed to speak with a lawyer, and Jacob said he knew one, a man named Elias Barrow who had an office above the hardware store on Chestnut Street and who was, Jacob said, honest in a profession where that was not always a given. They rode into town together on the 5th morning. The ride was easy in the way that things become easy when you have done them several times with the same person. A natural match of pacing, conversation that started and stopped without awkwardness, shared attention to the land moving past on either side of the road. The plains in autumn had a beauty that was not soft but was enormous, the long grass going gold and bronze, the sky so vast and blue it made the chest ache, the hawks circling on the thermals above the creek bottoms. "Did you always want to stay in Kansas?" Bessie asked during a quiet stretch of road. "I thought about going further west," Jacob said. "California, Montana Territory. But my father settled this land and he worked it hard and I did not want to leave it for nothing. And there is good grass here and good water and the horses do well." He was quiet for a moment. "My father died 5 years ago, my mother the year before. My sister Margaret married a man in Wichita and moved there. It has been just me and the horses and Amos and the dog." "What is the dog's name?" He looked slightly embarrassed. "Scout. That is a good name for a dog. He named himself, more or less. He scouts every corner of the property at least twice a day looking for threats that are never there." She laughed, and he looked at her when she laughed with the expression she was beginning to understand was particular to her. The one that was not quite a smile but was warmer than his usual steadiness, as if her laughter had found a frequency that resonated somewhere in him. Elias Barrow was a compact, wiry man in his 50s with spectacles on a chain and ink stains on his fingers, and the quiet authority of a man who had read more law than most people read in a lifetime. He listened to Bessie's account of the marriage and her departure with careful attention, asking questions that were precise and relevant. And then he said that the legal situation was complicated but not hopeless. Under Kansas territorial law in 1878, there were grounds for annulment on the basis of misrepresentation if Bessie could demonstrate that Gerald Pratt had concealed material information about the nature of their married life, specifically the restriction of her liberty and property. The matter of Clover the horse was, Barrow said with a straight face, potentially useful as evidence of intent. He also said that Gerald Pratt had already visited his office. He did not say what was discussed, citing professional ethics, but his expression communicated clearly enough that Gerald had been exploring his options. "Move quickly," Barrow said. "The longer the ambiguity, the more leverage he has." Outside on the sidewalk afterward, Bessie stood for a moment and absorbed the complexity of her situation. She had left a wedding. She needed a lawyer. She had $43 and the kindness of a man she had known for 5 days. The situation was uncomfortable and legally precarious, and she was, underneath all of it, something she had not expected to be. She was happy, not the happiness of ease, the happiness of being exactly where she was supposed to be, in her own skin, on her own feet, making her own decisions. It was unfamiliar and it was bracing, and it was real in a way that almost nothing in the previous year of her life had been. Jacob was waiting for her at the hitching post where they had tied the horses. He had his hat off and was running a hand through his dark hair, looking at the sky, and she had a moment of seeing him as if for the first time again, the strong, uncomplicated lines of him, the quietness that was not emptiness but depth. He was a man who listened to the world before he spoke to it, and in Bessie's experience that was the rarest kind. He looked down when he heard her step. "How does it look?" "Manageable," she said. "Complicated but manageable." She took a breath. "Mr. Barrow needs a retainer, $15. That leaves you 28. "Yes," she paused, "I will find work. There must be something in this town for a woman who can sew and cook and manage a household and ride a horse without falling off." Jacob put his hat back on. "There is," he said, "but you have helped considerably with the horses this week, and I have not paid you for it, and I should." She looked at him. "I was not expecting payment." "I know," he said. "That is exactly why I am offering it." She held his gaze for a moment, and something shifted between them in the crisp morning air, something that had been building its pressure quietly all week and was now acknowledging itself. She looked away first. "That is very fair," she said, and her voice was slightly different than usual, slightly more careful. He cleared his throat. "We should get back. I have a buyer coming this afternoon to look at 2 of the geldings." "I would like to watch if that is all right," she said. "I want to see how you assess a buyer." He looked at her with a nearly smile. "You want to learn the trade." "I want to learn everything I can," she said simply. "I have been too long in circumstances where learning was not encouraged." The horse sale that afternoon was instructive, in every way Bessie had hoped. The buyer was a rancher from Barber County named Emmett Walsh, a big cheerful man with a red face and a firm handshake, and he and Jacob went through a careful, respectful negotiation that took the better part of 2 hours and involved a great deal of walking around both geldings and discussion of bloodlines and temperament and the condition of their hooves. Jacob priced fairly and held his ground without being combative, and Emmett Walsh eventually paid what Jacob asked because he recognized he was getting genuine value. Bessie watched from the paddock fence and took in everything. Afterward, while Jacob and Emmett drank coffee on the porch, Emmett noticed Bessie and asked, with the frank curiosity of a man who saw no reason not to, whether she was Jacob's wife. Jacob said no. Emmett looked between them with the comprehension of someone who had been married a long time and understood certain things about proximity and habit. He said nothing further on the subject. When Emmett Walsh had driven his horses away down the road, Jacob sat back on the porch with his coffee and looked at the paddocks in the late afternoon light, and Bessie sat in the other porch chair with hers, and Scout the dog lay between them on the boards with his nose on his paws, and the world was quiet and golden in that way the Kansas plains achieve in the last hour before sunset. "You are good at that," Bessie said. "The selling. You never pushed." "Pushing makes a man feel cornered," Jacob said. "A cornered man resents his decisions afterward. I would rather he drive away feeling like he got exactly what he came for. My father was the same in his dealings." She looked at the horses in the paddock. He was a farmer, not prosperous but fair. People came back to him year after year because he was consistent. "That is the highest praise," Jacob said quietly. The evenings had become the thing Bessie valued most, which surprised her. After supper, which they had fallen into cooking together as if by long arrangement, they sat by the fire and sometimes talked and sometimes did not, and Jacob read and Bessie mended or wrote letters, and Scout dozed, and the house was full of the warm, ordinary peace of people being comfortable in each other's company. It was domestic in a way that should have felt premature given that she had known him less than 2 weeks, and she was aware of that, but the awareness existed alongside something that was more convincing than caution. On the 9th evening he told her about the woman he had almost married 5 years ago. He told it simply, without self-pity, the way a man tells a fact he has made peace with. Her name had been Alice Crane, from a family in Wichita, and they had been engaged for a year. She had come out to see the ranch and had looked at the Kansas plains and the small house and the horses, and then she had looked at Jacob and she had said, kindly and with genuine regret, that she could not do it, that she had thought she could but she could not, and that she was sorry. She had married a merchant in Wichita the following year and by all accounts was content. "I did not blame her," Jacob said. He was looking at the fire. "This is not an easy life. It is not for everyone." "But you never tried again," Bessie said carefully. "I tried once more," he said. "A woman in town. It did not get as far as an engagement. She was kind too, but she wanted a man who would stay in town, who would run a business on the main street and come home at regular hours." He paused. "I'm not that man." Bessie looked at the fire. She thought about what it would mean to be the person who fit the thing Jacob Hudson was, to love the open land and the horses and the honest simplicity of a life built on work and patience, and the deep satisfaction of raising something good. She thought about the fact that she was thinking this at all. "I think," she said slowly, "that Alice Crane was not wrong to know herself, but I also think she was missing something she did not see." Jacob looked at her. "What did she miss?" Bessie met his eyes across the firelight. "That the life you are describing is not a limitation. It is a wholeness." Jacob was very still. The fire made small sounds. Scout shifted in his sleep. The evening pressed around the house in its quiet autumn way, and Jacob Hudson looked at Bessie Fletcher with an expression that was not the nearly smile and was not the quiet steadiness she had catalogued, but was something she had not seen on his face before. Something open. Something that had been waiting in the deep of him for a very long time and had decided, quietly and with full conviction, that its waiting was over. He said nothing right away. The moment was too large for immediate words, and they both seemed to understand that. He looked back at the fire and she looked back at the fire, and after a while he said, in a different voice than usual, "Good night, Bessie," and she said, "Good night, Jacob," and they went to their respective rooms, and nothing had been said that could not be undone, and everything had changed. 2 days later, Gerald Pratt made his second appearance. He did not come to the ranch. He was smarter than that. He sent Bessie's Uncle Horace instead. And Horace arrived at the ranch house door in the middle of the afternoon with his hat in his hands and his well-practiced expression of wounded unclehood in place. Bessie answered the door and looked at Horace and felt a cold clarity replace the momentary alarm. "Bessie," Horace said, "you have got to stop this foolishness and come back." "Come in," she said, with the kind of courtesy that keeps a conversation from running into the street. She stepped back and let him in and did not offer coffee. Horace was a thick, florid man of 55 with mutton-chop whiskers and the nervous energy of someone who had built his social position on managing other people's affairs, without quite having the standing to do so. He sat down at the table and turned his hat in his hands and laid out Gerald Pratt's position, which was that Gerald was prepared to be magnanimous about the incident if Bessie came home immediately and there was no more talk of lawyers. Gerald was even prepared to discuss the horse, Horace added, with the air of a man presenting an excellent concession. "The horse," Bessie said. "He says Clover can stay," Horace said. "He is being generous, Bessie. A lot of men would not offer that." "He is being generous about keeping something that is already mine," Bessie said. "That is not generosity, Uncle Horace. That is the appearance of it." Horace's expression shifted into something less conciliatory. "You are going to throw away a good match because of stubbornness." "I left because of stubbornness," Bessie agreed. "I am not going back because I have had 11 days to think clearly about what my life with Gerald Pratt would look like, and the picture it makes is not one I will live inside." "You have been living in the house of an unmarried man," Horace said. "Do you understand what people are saying?" "I understand that people are saying whatever Gerald Pratt is encouraging them to say, and I also understand that the actual shape of what has happened here is that I refused a marriage that was made for me without my agreement, and I am now in a safe place with a decent person while I arrange my legal affairs." She looked at her uncle steadily. "I am 22 years old, Uncle Horace, not 14. You cannot arrange me like furniture." Horace's face went through several expressions before settling on resignation. "Gerald will not let this sit, Bessie. He has pride." "Yes," she said. "I know. His pride is part of why I left." After Horace had gone, Jacob came in from the barn where he had been working and found Bessie sitting at the kitchen table with her hands flat on the wood, looking at the middle distance with the focused expression of someone thinking several moves ahead. He did not ask right away. He washed his hands at the basin and poured 2 cups of coffee and put one in front of her and sat down. She told him. She told him all of it, Horace's visit and Gerald's position and the shape of what was likely to come next, which was pressure on Barrow, pressure on local opinion, possibly pressure on Jacob himself through some combination of social and economic influence that Gerald Pratt was very capable of deploying. Jacob listened. When she was finished, he was quiet for a moment and then he said, "I have been in Caldwell for 8 years. My father before me for 20. Gerald Pratt has money and connections and I respect what that means." He paused. "But he does not have the only ground in this town. And there are people here who know me and know what kind of man I am, and their opinion is worth more to me in the long run than Gerald Pratt's comfort." Bessie looked at him. "I do not want to bring trouble to your door." "You knocked on my door," he said, and there was something quiet and warm in the way he said it, as if the knocking had been a gift he intended to honor. "I answered it. That is where we are." The letter from Elias Barrow arrived the following week with information that was both encouraging and complicated. Barrow had found a legal angle, specifically an 1874 Kansas statute regarding the validity of marriages contracted under material misrepresentation of conditions. The difficulty was that it required witnesses and documentation, and it would take time, possibly several months of proceedings. In the meantime, Bessie's status was ambiguous, and Gerald Pratt's attorney had already sent a letter arguing that she had abandoned the marriage and forfeited certain protections. It was also during this week that the matter of Clover reached its crisis. Bessie had been thinking about the mare constantly. Clover was in Gerald Pratt's stable, cared for by his hands, and whatever Gerald's faults, he ran a proper operation and the horse was unlikely to be mistreated. But Clover was hers. The papers of ownership were in her name, her own name, filed at the Abilene Registry before she had ever heard of Gerald Pratt. Jacob had confirmed that this mattered. "If the ownership papers are in your name and were executed before any arrangement with Pratt," he said, "then the horse is yours regardless of anything else. That is property law. Pratt will not see it that way. What Pratt sees it as does not change what it is." On a Wednesday morning with a clear autumn sky and a northwest wind, they rode to the Pratt ranch together. Jacob had said simply, "I will come with you," and Bessie had not argued. They rode the 4 miles to the ranch with Scout sitting importantly in the bed of Jacob's small wagon, which they took because Bessie needed the capacity to bring Clover home. Gerald Pratt met them in the yard. He had seen them coming up the road, and he had come out to the porch, and he was standing there with a stillness that was its own kind of statement, the stillness of a man who controls his territory and considers everything within sight of his front door to be within his dominion. Bessie climbed down from the wagon seat before Jacob could offer his hand. She walked to the porch and looked at Gerald Pratt without flinching. "I have come for my horse," she said. "Her papers are in my name from the Abilene registry. I have copies with my attorney. I am taking her today." Gerald looked at her for a long moment, and then at Jacob standing by the wagon, and then at the road beyond, as if calculating something. "The horse is on my property," he said. "The horse belongs to me," Bessie said. "Those are different facts." The silence had weight. A couple of ranch hands had appeared at the barn doors, not aggressively, just present, the way men in these situations appear. Jacob stood easy at the wagon, his thumbs in his belt, watching with neutral attention. Gerald said finally, "Get the horse." And that was all. He turned and went back into the house. One of the ranch hands led Clover out of the barn, and Clover saw Bessie and lifted her head and nickered with the particular sound Bessie had been hearing in her dreams for 2 weeks. And Bessie put her hands on the mare's face and pressed her forehead against the broad dun nose and breathed. On the ride home, Clover led behind the wagon on a long line, her hooves familiar on the road, her ears moving with comfortable interest at the world around her. Bessie sat on the wagon seat beside Jacob and did not speak for a long while, and Jacob drove Amos with easy hands and did not require conversation. "You were not afraid," he said eventually. "I was very afraid," she said. "I have learned to act through it." He looked at her then, a full, unhurried look of the kind he did not often allow himself, and she felt it the way you feel the sun when a cloud moves away from it, the warmth of sudden directness. "That is courage," he said. "Just so you know, that is exactly what that is." The autumn deepened. The great cattle herds finished their last drives north, and the trail hands went back south, and Caldwell settled into its quieter winter personality. The saloon still open, but less frantically so. The streets less crowded, the air sharpening toward frost. Jacob brought the horses in from the far pasture and began the winter preparations that occupied most of his days, mending fences and stacking hay, and going over the barn roof with careful attention to any weakness the Kansas winter might find. Bessie helped with all of it. Not because she had to. She had made herself genuinely useful around the property now, helping with the horses and the small kitchen garden that still had late-season root vegetables in it, and Jacob paid her fairly for her work. But she helped with the winter preparations because they needed doing, and because working beside him had become one of the things she valued most about the shape of her days. They were mending the south paddock fence on a cold, gray afternoon in November when Jacob said, without preamble, the way he said all the most important things, "I think you should know that I am in love with you." The hammer in Bessie's hand stilled against the fence post. She looked at him. He was looking at the fence rail, his expression the careful patience of a man who has said the true thing and is now waiting for the world to respond to it. "I am not saying it to pressure you," he said. "Your situation is what it is, and I understand that, and I am not asking anything of you that you are not ready to give. I am saying it because I think you have the right to know, and because I am 30 years old and I have been waiting, without knowing quite what I was waiting for a very long time, and I think I know now what I was waiting for." He finally looked at her. "I was waiting for someone who knocked on my door in a wedding dress and came inside and made coffee and worked the horses and got her mare back from a man twice her age without trembling, and who sees this land and this life not as what she is settling for, but as what she wants." Bessie set the hammer down on the fence post very deliberately. The wind moved the grass of the far pasture in long, rolling waves. Clover was at the fence on the other side of the paddock, her head over the rail, watching them with the untroubled interest of a horse who has decided this particular situation is safe. "I have been afraid," Bessie said, to say what is true to me, because I have been inside a situation where what was true to me did not seem to matter. And I have been afraid of moving too quickly because moving quickly is how I ended up in a wedding dress on your doorstep." "That is a fair thing to be afraid of," Jacob said. "But I am going to tell you something true," she said. She looked at him steadily, this man with his dark eyes and his patient hands and his house full of books and his horses that trusted him completely. "I have never felt at home anywhere the way I feel at home here, not in my father's house, not anywhere. And I know the difference between home and hiding because I have been doing both, and this is not hiding." Jacob's expression did the thing it did, the shift from steadiness to something warmer and deeper, the thing she had no word for yet but was beginning to think she might spend a long time finding the right one. "Bessie," he said. "I am in love with you too," she said. "I have been for some time. I was waiting until I was sure the feeling was mine and not just gratitude." "Is it yours?" "Completely and absolutely mine," she said. "Yes." He reached across the fence rail and took her hand. His hand was warm and calloused and held hers with the same quality of care that characterized everything he did, firmly, honestly, without unnecessary force. They stood on either side of the fence rail with their hands joined, and the Kansas wind moving around them and Clover watching with her ears pricked. And it was not like any romantic moment Bessie had ever read about in the novels that circulated among her friends. It was better than that. It was real in every dimension. The legal proceedings with Elias Barrow progressed through November and into December. Gerald Pratt contested the annulment filing, as Barrow had anticipated, but the documentation was solid. Bessie had written a careful account of the circumstances of the marriage, the arrangement through her uncle without her full, informed consent, the condition Gerald had stated regarding her horse, and several other aspects of their brief domestic experience that painted a picture of a woman who had been managed rather than courted. 2 women from the wedding supper came forward quietly to corroborate parts of her account. Apparently neither of them had liked Gerald particularly, and their statements were added to the file. Mrs. Aragon next door declared herself available as a character witness for Bessie, and said so to Barrow directly and with considerable enthusiasm. Jacob provided a sworn statement of Bessie's condition, an account upon arriving at his door, which Barrow found useful. The grounds for annulment on the basis of coercion and misrepresentation, in the context of the specific Kansas statute Barrow had identified, began to look increasingly solid. Gerald Pratt, it emerged from Barrow's sources, was a man who calculated his battles carefully. He had resources, but he also had a reputation to maintain and a business community he operated within. And the story of a young woman fleeing her own wedding reception was not helping him in the court of local opinion regardless of what his attorney filed. By the end of November, his attorney sent Barrow a letter indicating Gerald's willingness to allow the annulment to proceed in exchange for certain agreements. Bessie read the proposed terms, discussed them with Barrow, and accepted those that were reasonable and rejected those that were not. On the 5th of December, 1878, the annulment was granted by the territorial court. Bessie sat in Barrow's office and read the document, and then sat quietly for a moment while Barrow gave her the space to do so. Then she folded the document and put it in her coat pocket and thanked Barrow and shook his hand and walked out into the cold December street. Jacob was at the hitching post with Amos and Clover. He looked at her face when she came out and understood before she said anything. He came forward and she walked into his arms with the directness of a woman who has settled certain things about herself, and he held her with his chin on top of her head and his coat warm around her and the December wind pulling at her hair. "It is done," she said. "Yes," he said. "I am Bessie Fletcher," she said. "Just Bessie Fletcher, my own self." His arms tightened around her very slightly. "There is no one I would rather know," he said quietly and sincerely, and she believed him completely. They celebrated with coffee and pie at the small restaurant on Chestnut Street, and then they rode home in the winter afternoon, with the horses breathing steam and the frozen grass crackling under their hooves, and the sky going pink and orange above the western plains. And Bessie thought that this was what the wide country was supposed to look like. Not a backdrop to someone else's plan, but a foreground to her own life, immediate and real and hers. In the weeks that followed, Jacob Hudson did a thing that was consistent with everything she knew about him. He did not rush. He courted her the way he did everything, steadily and honestly and without performance, and she appreciated it more than she could easily say. He brought her wildflowers from the cold weather growth along the creek bottom and left them on the kitchen table without announcement. He spent an afternoon building a better shelter for Clover in the paddock, because the north wind came at an angle that caught the mare in the hindquarters, and he told Bessie about it matter-of-factly, as if it were a regular maintenance task, and not a thing done specifically from attention to what she loved. He read to her in the evening sometimes, and she read back, and Scout lay between their chairs in profound canine contentment, and Mrs. Aragon came over twice a week for supper, and occasionally brought her adult daughter Maria, who was Bessie's age and had 4 children and an opinion about everything. And the house was full in the winter evenings in a way it had not been before. The letter from Bessie's Uncle Horace arrived in January, and it was, of all things, an apology. Not a thorough or fully adequate one. The language of it still carried Horace's habitual defensiveness, but buried inside the qualifications was something that appeared to be genuine regret. He had not known, he wrote, that Gerald Pratt was the kind of man Bessie had described. He had taken Gerald's financial standing as evidence of his character, which he admitted now was a foolish conflation. He would not contact her further unless she wished it. Bessie wrote back. She was not ready to forgive entirely, because what Horace had done had put her in a position of genuine danger, and the fact that Gerald had chosen not to pursue that danger physically did not erase the risk. But she wrote that she had received his letter, and that she was well and safe, and that in time there might be more to say between them. It was the honest reply, and honesty was the currency she intended to trade in from now on. On a Sunday afternoon in late January, with 6 inches of snow on the ground and the horses contentedly indoors and a fire that had been burning since dawn, Jacob asked her to marry him. He did it in the way that felt natural to him, which was sitting across the fireplace from her in their 2 chairs with Scout between them, and he said, "I have been thinking about asking you something, and I have been taking my time because I wanted to be sure you had yours." Bessie looked up from the letter she was writing. "I know it has not been long," he said, "in calendar terms. But I also know that I have never been certain of anything the way I am certain of this, and I have found in my experience that when you are that certain of something, waiting for a calendar to catch up to the feeling is not caution but delay." Bessie set the letter down. "I would like to marry you, Bessie Fletcher," Jacob said. "Not because you need shelter or because it would resolve any remaining question of propriety, or because you knocked on my door and I feel responsible for you. Because I want to spend my mornings with you. Because you make the horses better and the house warmer and the evenings worth looking forward to. Because you are the most genuinely honest person I have ever known, and I think that honesty is what I have been looking for my entire life without quite having a name for it." He paused. "And because I love you, which is possibly the most important thing, but I wanted to give it some company." Bessie was quiet for a long moment. She looked at the fire and then at him, at his steady face and his honest eyes and the particular patience with which he waited for her answer, not anxiously but with the confidence of a man who has said exactly what is true and knows that truth has its own weight. "Yes," she said. It came out simply and clearly and with the whole of her behind it. "Jacob, yes." They were married on the 14th of February, 1879, at the small church on Elm Street in Caldwell, by a minister named Reverend Aldous Burke, who had a reputation for performing ceremonies without unnecessary ornamentation, and who did so with graceful efficiency. Mrs. Aragon stood for Bessie, and a rancher friend of Jacob's, named Thomas Whitfield stood for him. Clara Hennessy had come down from Dodge City by stage and sat in the second row and cried quietly into her handkerchief with the particular emotion of someone watching the right thing happen at the right time. Horace Fletcher was not there. Bessie had not invited him. That chapter was still folding itself toward possible resolution, and she was content to let it take its time. The ceremony was simple, and Reverend Burke said the words in his direct, unhurried way, and when he got to the part where Jacob and Bessie faced each other and held each other's hands, Bessie looked up at Jacob and saw in his face the thing she had first noticed in the doorway of his house on the midnight of her arrival, that expression of recognition, of someone seeing the thing they had been looking for and understanding at last that the search was finished. She felt it too, that completion, that settling of something that had been in motion for a long time. They said the words. The small congregation witnessed them. Outside the church windows, Caldwell went about its winter business, the wind moving through the empty cattle pens, the smoke rising from a dozen chimneys, the great Kansas plain lying still and white around the town in all directions. Inside, Bessie Fletcher became Bessie Hudson, and it was the first time in her life that a name had felt like freedom. The winter settled into them with a comfortable depth. They worked the ranch together through February and March, Jacob training a new young quarter horse he had acquired from a breeder in Barber County, and Bessie developing a more formal role in the management of the horses, keeping records of bloodlines and health, and the particular qualities of each animal that made it suited or not suited to different buyers. She had a head for it, both of them discovered, the organization and the memory for detail, and what had been Jacob's somewhat approximate record-keeping became thorough and useful under her management. The 3 mares in foal came to their time in late winter. 2 foaled without incident, a bay colt and a chestnut filly, in the cold March nights with Jacob and Bessie both in the barn, lantern-lit and quiet, watching the ancient miracle of it with attention. The 3rd mare had a harder time, and Jacob spent most of a night in focused work, getting the foal positioned correctly, and Bessie held the mare's head and spoke to her steadily. And when the foal finally came, a strong gray colt who was on his feet within the hour, Bessie sat back in the straw of the stall and felt a satisfaction so complete it was almost overwhelming. Jacob looked across the stall at her. They were both tired and cold and covered in straw, and she had never in her life been so content. He smiled at her, a full smile this time, the kind he did not always give, but when he gave it, it was like a window opening. "Good work," he said. "Good work yourself," she said. "He is beautiful." "He is," Jacob said, looking at the colt. "Strong. He will be something worth selling in 2 years." He looked at her. "You want to name him?" Bessie looked at the gray colt, still wet and already curious, his big eyes taking in the lantern-lit world with the alert wonder of the very new. "Midnight," she said. For the hour he took his time about arriving. Jacob considered this. "Midnight," he said, trying it. "Yes, that fits." By spring the ranch had expanded in several directions. 2 more horses sold well, one to a cavalry buyer who had come specifically on the recommendation of Emmett Walsh, and Jacob put the money toward repairs on the barn and a new paddock fence on the north side. Bessie's organizational system for the horse records had attracted interest from a neighboring rancher named Bauer, who asked if she would help him set up something similar for his cattle operation, and she agreed at a reasonable rate, and it became a small additional income that felt entirely hers. Clara Hennessy wrote regularly from Dodge City, and in April she wrote with news that she was herself to be married to a school board member, a quiet man she described with great affection and some amusement. Bessie wrote back with the warmest of congratulations and an invitation to visit in the summer. The question of Horace came to a partial resolution in May, when he arrived in Caldwell unannounced and knocked on the ranch house door and stood there with his hat in his hands looking simultaneously remorseful and uncomfortable, which was, Bessie decided, probably the most honest he had ever managed. She invited him in. She introduced him to Jacob, who shook his hand with the same neutral courtesy he extended to everyone, until they proved they deserved more or less. Horace sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee and said, in his circuitous way, that he had not been a good steward of her well-being, that he had placed too much value on what he had seen as financial security for her and not enough on her own judgment and wishes, and that he was sorry. It was not a perfect apology, but it was real enough. Bessie looked at this thick, florid, fundamentally limited man who had been her father's brother and had tried, in his blundering way, to manage what he saw as her best interests, and she found that she could hold both the harm he had caused and the limited good intent behind it without letting either cancel the other. "I forgive you, Uncle Horace," she said. "I do not forget the facts of it, but I forgive you." Horace Fletcher nodded and looked at his coffee cup, and was, for possibly the first time in Bessie's memory, silent because he did not know how to respond to Grace rather than because he was calculating his next move. Jacob refilled his cup and asked him about the road from Abilene, and the conversation moved into easier territory, and Horace stayed for dinner and rode out before dark, and when he had gone, Jacob looked at Bessie across the cleared table and said, "That was generous of you." "It was honest," she said. "Those are not always the same thing, but they were today." Summer came to the Kansas plains in its enormous way, the sky going so blue it was almost unbearable, and the heat pressing down on the long grass, and the horses moving in and out of the shade of the barn in their careful daily rhythm. Bessie worked in the kitchen garden early in the mornings before the heat settled in, and in the afternoons she worked with the horses or with the records or rode clover along the creek bottom in the cooler shade of the cottonwoods. Jacob was everywhere, the particular industry of a man who loves his work and has never needed to be managed into it, and she loved watching him in the way that you love watching someone be perfectly and completely themselves. They argued twice that summer, real arguments with raised voices and temporarily irreconcilable positions, and both times they worked through them because they had both, each in their different histories, seen what unaddressed conflict does to the air inside a house, and they were not willing to breathe that air. The first was about money, specifically about whether to take on a significant debt to buy an adjacent parcel of land that Jacob wanted badly. Bessie's position was that the debt was too large for the current income of the ranch, and that the land would come available again. Jacob's position was that land in that location would not wait. They talked it through with the focused seriousness of people who respect each other's intelligence, and eventually landed on a compromise. They would approach the seller about a payment arrangement that spread the cost over 3 years, and if the seller would not agree, they would let it go. The seller agreed. The land was theirs, 300 additional acres of good Kansas grass. The second argument was less financial and more personal, about the degree to which Bessie had been corresponding with a former schoolmate who had also known Gerald Pratt, and who had information about Gerald's ongoing activities. Jacob's concern was her safety, specifically that maintaining contact with anyone in Gerald's orbit, however indirect, kept a door open that he would have preferred closed. Bessie's position was that she was not Gerald Pratt's property and had not been since December, and she would correspond with whomever she chose. Jacob's response was that he agreed entirely with that principle and was simply expressing concern as her husband, which was different from issuing a command. This distinction, once made, dissolved the argument immediately, because it was the true thing and they both knew it. In the end, the correspondence with the former schoolmate turned out to be irrelevant, because Gerald Pratt left Caldwell that summer for good. He sold his ranch to a Texas cattle consortium and moved, according to Mrs. Aragon's reliable intelligence network, to Denver, where his money would buy him a different kind of life with different social arrangements. The news arrived on a Tuesday morning, and Bessie received it with a simple, clean relief. The relief of a door that you have not been worrying about consciously nevertheless being decisively closed. In late August, Bessie told Jacob she was expecting a child. She told him on the porch in the evening, with the first hint of autumn cooling the air and the horses in the far paddock, and Scout at her feet in his usual position of vigilant repose. She said it simply, in the direct way she had learned to say true things, and watched his face. Jacob Hudson sat very still for a moment. Then he turned to look at her fully, and his expression was something she had not seen on his face before, though it had some qualities of other things she knew there. It was wonder. Pure and undefended wonder, the kind that has nowhere to hide and does not want to. "Are you well?" he said first. "Are you healthy?" "I am very well," she said. "I feel entirely myself." He was quiet for another moment, and then he said, "I have hoped for this for a long time, a family, this specific kind of life." He paused. "I had begun to believe it might not come." "It came," she said. "We are it." He reached over and took her hand and held it, and they sat on the porch in the evening light with the Kansas plains breathing around them, and the horses grazing, and the sky going through its magnificent autumn changes of color. And there was nothing complicated or unresolved between them, just the warm, solid fact of what they were, and what they were becoming. The winter of 1879 moving into 1880 was a generous one. Not mild. Kansas was not mild in winter, but the kind of cold that is clarifying rather than brutal, the kind that keeps the barn tight and makes the fire more valuable, and brings people close in the sensible way of shared warmth. Bessie grew through the winter with the pragmatic competence of a woman who intends to keep working at everything she has worked at, and does not view her condition as an interruption. Mrs. Aragon was delighted, and showed it by appearing at the door twice weekly with food and opinions about childbearing, some of which were useful, and some of which were the particular folklore of her own experience, and which Bessie received with respect and gentle evaluation. Clara Hennessy, now married to her school board member and living in Dodge City, wrote with excitement and practical advice. Margaret Hudson, Jacob's sister in Wichita, wrote a letter that arrived in November and was warm and welcoming in a way that made Bessie feel, for the first time, that she had a sister. The child was born on the 22nd of March, 1880, after a hard labor that tested Bessie's considerable resources but did not defeat them. The local doctor, a solid man named Alderson who served the Caldwell area, attended along with Mrs. Aragon, who had delivered a significant number of babies in her lifetime, and had opinions about how Alderson was managing the proceedings that she expressed with full candor. The baby was a boy. A large, healthy, vigorous boy with Jacob's dark hair and Bessie's determined expression, born in the early morning with the March wind coming off the plains and the horses moving in the paddock below the bedroom window. Jacob was allowed in when it was done, and he came and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son with the same absolute wonder he had shown on the porch in August, undefended and complete. He touched the baby's hand very gently with one finger, and the baby gripped it with the instinctive strength of the newborn, and Jacob looked at Bessie over the dark head of their son, and his eyes were bright. "What do we call him?" he said. Bessie had been thinking about this. "I would like to call him William," she said. "After my father." She paused. "If that is agreeable to you." "William," Jacob said, trying it the way he had tried midnight, and it settled into the air between them with the rightness of something chosen correctly. "William Hudson, yes." "William Henry Hudson," Bessie said. "Henry for yours." Jacob looked at her for a moment that contained too much to be spoken simply. "Thank you," he said. The spring of 1880 brought the ranch into the fullness of what it had been building toward. William slept in a cradle that Jacob had built from pine in the weeks before the birth, with a care for joinery and smoothness that Bessie had found deeply moving, and he grew with the robust enthusiasm of a child who intends to be noticed. The horses foaled that spring with a run of good luck, 4 strong foals including a gray filly who showed early signs of the quality that would make her valuable, and the record books Bessie kept were full of careful entries in her clear hand. Mrs. Aragon became William's honorary grandmother in all the ways that mattered and treated the role with tremendous seriousness. Maria, her daughter, became one of Bessie's closest friends, and their children played together in the yard when the weather was fine, and Bessie found in that friendship the particular sustenance of knowing someone who does not need explanation, who has seen the dailiness of your life and values it. Thomas Whitfield, Jacob's friend who had stood at their wedding, brought his wife Emma out to meet Bessie in the spring, and Emma Whitfield turned out to be a woman of sharp humor and deep kindness, and the four of them became the core of a small social world that suited Jacob and Bessie very well, good people who worked hard and laughed easily, and did not require performance from anyone. In the summer of 1880, a letter arrived from Margaret Hudson in Wichita saying she and her husband were planning to visit in September, and the visit was full and happy, with Margaret being exactly the sister Bessie had hoped for, warm and funny, and genuinely fond of her brother in the affectionate, exasperated way of siblings who know each other completely. She held William with practiced ease and declared him magnificent, which he was. Horace Fletcher came once more in the summer, and brought with him a softness he had not previously shown, a man who has done some genuine reckoning in the quiet of his own house, and has come out the other side changed in small but real ways. He sat on the porch and held his great-nephew William Fletcher Hudson, who grabbed his mutton-chop whiskers with the enthusiasm of an 8-month-old, and Horace laughed in a surprised, unguarded way that Bessie had never heard from him before, and it was the most honest she had ever seen him, and she thought that was a beginning of something, slow and uncertain but real. The years moved forward in the way that good years do, not uneventfully, but with the deep current of rightness running under everything. Bessie and Jacob expanded the horse operation in 1881, purchasing 2 mares of exceptional bloodlines from a breeder in Texas, and beginning to develop a reputation that reached beyond the immediate region. The cavalry contracts continued. The private buyers came more frequently and from farther away. Jacob's name, and now Bessie's organizational expertise alongside it, meant something in the horse trade of southern Kansas. William learned to walk by hanging onto Scout's patient brown coat, which Scout endured with the dignity of a dog who understands his purpose. He learned to say horse before he learned to say anything else, which was exactly what Jacob and Bessie expected. He followed his father around the barn from the time he could walk steadily, watching with the concentrated attention of a child who is absorbing the world into himself, and Jacob spoke to him about the horses and the work with the same seriousness he would have brought to speaking to an adult, because he had noticed that children learn better when they are not talked down to. In the spring of 1882, Bessie told Jacob there would be a second child. He received this news with the same wonder as the first, undimmed by repetition, which told her something true about him. The second child was a girl, born in October of 1882, with Bessie's dark eyes and Jacob's serious mouth, and they named her Clara Rose Hudson, Clara for the friend who had written the letter that gave Bessie the courage to stay, and Rose because Jacob said she had arrived in the middle of the second flowering of the autumn prairie roses, and it seemed appropriate. Clara Hennessy traveled from Dodge City for the naming ceremony, and stood in the parlor of the ranch house with baby Clara in her arms and cried again, which had become something of a tradition, and nobody minded at all. The ranch in 1882 was 3 times the operation it had been when Bessie had arrived at its door in her muddy wedding dress. The house itself had been expanded with a second bedroom and a proper parlor with a fireplace that Jacob had built stone by stone over the course of one winter, and there were flowers in the front garden that Bessie had planted in her first spring, and that returned more abundantly each year. The kitchen garden was substantial and productive. Mrs. Aragon had a standing arrangement with the house that amounted to a beloved extended family, and the kitchen was often full of the comfortable noise of people who are glad to be in the same place. Scout was older now and slower in his scouting duties, but no less committed to them. He had adopted William as his particular responsibility and could be found at the boy's side through most of the waking day. And William had reciprocated by treating the dog with the kind of devoted, earnest love that children give the animals that help them understand what love means. Midnight, the gray colt born in the hard March night of 1879, had become exactly what Jacob had predicted: a fine, powerful horse who had sold to a rancher in Colorado Territory for a price that had made Barrow the lawyer, who had become a friend, whistle when they mentioned it. Clover was still in the paddock, older and a little rounder and entirely unchanged in her opinion of her situation, which was that it suited her very well. She had foaled twice, and both of her foals had inherited her soundness and her intelligence, and Jacob said that Clover's bloodline would be part of the Hudson horse operation for as long as they wanted it. On the last evening of the year 1882, with William asleep in his room and baby Clara in the cradle and Scout stretched out by the fire and the new year a few hours away, Jacob and Bessie sat on opposite sides of the fireplace in their 2 chairs, which had been reupholstered once and were better for it, and the house was warm and quiet and full of the accumulated presence of everything that had happened within it. Jacob was reading. Bessie was writing a letter to Margaret. The fire made its small sounds. Outside, the Kansas night was clear and cold and enormous, the stars laid across the black sky in their thousands, the prairie lying quiet in all directions. Bessie looked up from her letter and looked at Jacob, who was absorbed in his book, and she held the moment the way you hold something you know is precious, not desperately but with full attention, taking in every detail. The lamplight on his face, the way he turned pages with the same care he handled the horses, attentive and unhurried. The gray that was beginning at his temples, just beginning, which she found entirely beautiful. She thought about the night she had run across Gerald Pratt's pasture in her ruined wedding dress, and come stumbling through the dark streets of Caldwell, and raised her fist at the door with the lamp burning in the window. She thought about the door opening and the man with the lantern looking at her with that expression she had not been able to name. She understood the expression now. She had been carrying it herself for 4 years. It was the expression of someone seeing, for the first time and also for the last time in the best possible sense, the person they had been looking for. Jacob looked up from his book and found her watching him and held her gaze across the firelight with the easy intimacy of 2 people who have nothing to prove to each other, and he smiled, the full smile, the window opening. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "That I knocked on the wrong door," she said. "And found the exactly right one." He set his book down on his knee. "I think about that night," he said, "more than you might expect." "What do you think about it?" "I think," he said slowly, "that I had been sitting in this house for a long time waiting for something I could not name, reading my books, working the horses, doing everything right and wondering why doing everything right did not feel complete." He paused. "And then you knocked on the door, in a wedding dress, covered in mud, and told me you were not going back." His voice carried the warmth it had when he talked about things he loved most. "And whatever it was I had been waiting for, it was standing on my porch." Bessie felt the fullness of it. The 4 years and the legal proceedings and the annulment document, and the February wedding and William learning to walk on Scout's coat, and Clara Rose in her cradle, and the paddock full of horses, and the kitchen garden and the books on the shelf, and all the evenings, and the 2 arguments properly resolved, and the expanded land and Clover growing round in content, and the gray colt midnight sold to Colorado, and the porch chairs and the stone fireplace built stone by stone. All of it. The wholeness that she had named on the evening she had first named it. "You said," she told him, "that this life is not a limitation but a wholeness." "No," he said. "You said that." She considered this. "I did, didn't I?" "You did," he said. "On the 9th evening by that fire. I have thought about it ever since." "It is still true," she said. "It is more true now than when you said it," he said. The fire cracked and settled. Outside, somewhere in the distance, a coyote called once to the January dark, and the dark answered it with silence. The new year was coming, 1883, and it would bring what it brought: the horses and the foals and the work and the seasons, and whatever particular joys and difficulties. The Kansas plains would deliver to a house that faced them honestly and with full hands. Inside the house, the lamp burned steady and warm. Scout dreamed his old dog dreams. Baby Clara breathed in her cradle. William slept his deep, safe, beloved child's sleep. And Bessie Fletcher Hudson and Jacob Hudson sat across their fire from each other with nothing between them that needed resolving, nothing unsaid that needed saying, nothing uncertain that needed certainty, because they had built something true together from the materials of a desperate midnight, and a door that should not have been the right one, and an impossible grace that had made it so. Jacob picked up his book again. Bessie picked up her letter. The fire kept its own time. The year turned toward what came next. And in the big, breathing dark of the Kansas plain surrounding that small lit house, the coyotes called again, and the horses shifted in their stalls, and the stars moved in their ancient and indifferent way, and none of it touched the warmth inside, which was complete.